Well, Sandra and Bill, Tuesday, cops found a torso and arms in a Bronx apartment. Yesterday, they found the victim's head and legs inside a freezer in an apartment in Harlem. Today, police arrested the man who lives there. He is the man alleged of committing a particularly heinous and evil crime, 48-year-old Sheldon Johnson, accused of killing a man and dismembering his body. But Johnson says they have the wrong man.
I'm innocent.
The victim, 44-year-old Collin Small. Tuesday night, police found his torso and arms inside his apartment in the High Bridge section of the Bronx after the super called cops. Orlando Medina says a tenant called him around 1 a.m.
Someone was pleading for their life. She said she heard 2 gunshots. Someone saying, please don't kill me, I got family, something like that. And then 2 more gunshots. Pretty quickly. Coming in, coming out of the apartment with different articles of clothes, different wigs, you know. So it's weird. Everything was observed by the surveillance cameras. Right. All those things are, those things I saw.
Prosecutors allege at one point he was seen on video leaving the victim's apartment wearing the victim's clothing. Then last night, investigators say they found the victim's head and legs in Johnson's freezer at his Harlem apartment on 5th Avenue. The medical examiner says the victim was shot once in the head. The allegations sending shivers through the victim's Bronx building.
It feels like the devil just crawled through here.
Johnson is an ex-con who today works as a criminal justice reform advocate, seen here in a Facebook picture he posted with Manhattan DA Alvin Bragg. He served about 25 years behind bars for attempted murder and has a long rap sheet filled with other violent crimes. This is Johnson on Joe Rogan's podcast last month.
I had a wife, I had family still, my son was growing up. He was hearing stories about my so-called notoriety, and I just didn't want to be that dad.
Johnson went on to talk about turning his life around.
Got my GED. I left the gangs alone, which was a benefit for them because, I was what you call an authoritarian. I was a rule guy. I'm still a rule guy. I like rules. I like rules. I like structure.
The courtroom was filled with his supporters at his arraignment tonight, with one wearing a jacket reading, specializing in wrongful conviction cases. The executive director of his employer, the Queen's Defenders, also at court. They all declined comment.
It began with a sound no one in that Bronx apartment building ever forgot. 2 gunshots. A pause, the kind of silence that feels wrong. Then a man's voice, trembling, begging for his life. Please don't. I have a family. Those were the last known words of 44-year-old Collin Small. A plea so desperate, so raw, that even the neighbor who heard it said her legs went cold. And yet, it would take hours before anyone would learn what truly happened behind the locked door of apartment 6F. When NYPD finally entered that unit, nothing could have prepared them for the scene waiting inside. A man who did not belong there, a story that made no sense, and a discovery so horrifying that veteran officers had to step outside to catch their breath. But what makes this case even darker isn't only the brutality of the crime. It's who the suspect was. A man praised on podcasts, celebrated in reform circles, hailed as a symbol of redemption, someone who built a public image on saving lives, not taking them. Yet on that night, in that apartment, redemption meant nothing. Before we dive in, welcome to Crime Scene Exposed. Here we dig into the most infamous crimes, chilling disappearances, and criminal minds that shake the world. If you're new here, make sure to like and subscribe. We uncover the truth others overlook. Because what happened next is one of the most disturbing unravelings of a public persona New York has ever seen. And it all started with that single plea for mercy. How did this quiet Bronx tenant end up face-to-face with a man the world believed was reformed? Before his name was splashed across headlines, before detectives pieced him together from scattered remains across 2 boroughs, Collin Small was, in many ways, invisible to the outside world. Born in 1979 and raised in Harlem, Collin's life was shaped by the same environments that trapped many young men early. By adulthood, he had already encountered the criminal justice system. A felony assault conviction led to nearly a decade inside Sing Sing, a place where friendships, grudges, and alliances don't disappear after release. They follow you home. In October 2018, Collin was paroled. According to family and neighbors, he was trying to rebuild. He wasn't perfect, and he wasn't a headline. He was simply a man trying to stay afloat after years spent behind concrete walls. No luxury, no spotlight, just survival. He lived alone on the 6th floor of a High Bridge building in the Bronx. Neighbors knew him as the quiet tenant who didn't make trouble. A man who kept to himself, but didn't pose a threat. A man trying to keep his circle small, but for reasons no one understood at the time, he let the wrong person into his home. There is limited public detail about Collin's romantic life or family structure. Reporters couldn't confirm whether he had children or a spouse. But one detail stands above everything else. The neighbor who heard him pleading moments before his death heard him say 7 words that tell us everything we need to know. Please don't. I have a family. Those words are all we have. A fragment of a man whose life was mostly undocumented. A man the world didn't pay attention to until the day he died. And ironically, the man accused of killing him? He was the opposite, someone the world couldn't stop paying attention to. Who exactly was Sheldon Johnson? And how did a man with a celebrated redemption story end up in Collin's apartment that night? To understand the brutality of this case, you must understand the man at the center of it, a man New York once held up as proof that people can change. Sheldon Preston Johnson, Jr. was no stranger to violence. Even as a child, he spiraled early. He was arrested for trying to stab a teacher and blasting him with a fire extinguisher. That was the origin point of a trajectory that turned him into a Bloods gang member, a repeat offender, and eventually a prisoner, serving a 50-year sentence for attempted murder during a robbery. For most people, that would be the end of their story. But in May 2023, Sheldon was released after serving about 25 years. And almost overnight, he became a symbol, a changed man. Someone who spoke openly about gang life, trauma, and transformation. He appeared on popular podcasts. He lectured youth. He worked at a Queens public defender's office as a mentor. Media outlets treated him like a rare success story, a violent past redeemed by purpose. He knew how to speak. He knew how to command sympathy. And he knew how to present himself as a man who'd seen darkness and walked back into the light. But there were cracks in the narrative. His teenage son had later been involved in a manslaughter case, something reporters highlighted as part of a generational cycle. Sheldon's own violent past never fully disappeared. It lingered, unspoken but present, like a shadow waiting to re-emerge. And then there was something else. Sheldon and Collin weren't strangers. They had known each other since childhood. They had crossed paths in Sing Sing. And after their releases, Collin had reportedly supported him. 2 men with intertwined pasts. 2 men carrying the same scars. 2 men walking toward a collision that no one saw coming. What happened in the hours before Collin's death? And why did Sheldon enter that building in disguises? The connection between Collin Small and Sheldon Johnson wasn't random. It wasn't chance. And it wasn't something built overnight. Both men had grown up in the same world: Harlem, poverty, instability, and early exposure to violence. Their paths crossed long before that night in March 2024. They were childhood acquaintances, men who understood each other's pasts far better than they admitted publicly. And when both eventually landed in Sing Sing, those ties only tightened. In prison, connections can mean survival. Lines blur between friend, ally, and threat. When they both re-entered the free world, it made sense that paths would cross again. According to Collin's family, he had even supported Sheldon after his release, a quiet act of loyalty toward someone who claimed to be rebuilding. But loyalty can be dangerous when shadows linger behind smiles. Prosecutors say Collin and Sheldon remained in contact. Their shared history formed a kind of bond, not necessarily friendship, but a familiarity built on the years they spent behind bars. Whatever tensions existed between them were invisible to outsiders. No documented feud, no known dispute, no motive that investigators could confirm. And that is what makes this case so unsettling. Because while their connection explains why Sheldon may have been allowed inside Collin's apartment, it does nothing to explain what happened once the door closed. 2 men who survived prison. 2 men who were supposed to be rebuilding. 2 men with a shared past that ended in an unthinkable betrayal. And that betrayal unfolded over mere hours, a timeline captured almost entirely by a surveillance camera.
Tonight, we've learned the man accused in a brutal killing was an advocate for criminal justice. Police say body parts were found in the victim and the suspect's apartments. New surveillance photos show the suspect going in and out of the victim's home with bags, bins, even once wearing a wig. CBS 2's Naveen Dhaliwal is outside Bronx criminal court with the new developments tonight.
Sheldon Johnson faced a judge tonight, and he was remanded back to jail. Now, he's accused of dismembering a body. As to why, police are still trying to figure that out. This is the last image of Collin Small entering his Highbridge apartment on Tuesday, according to his super. It was a day later, Sheldon Johnson, seen in surveillance images, was found inside Small's Summit Avenue apartment, discovered with him a torso minus the head and arms. Cops took him into custody.
The first tenant tells me that she heard 2 gunshots, that she came outside.
It was the building super, Orlando Medina, who called police for a welfare check on Small after 2 neighbors reporting hearing gunshots from that 6th floor apartment. Giovanna Diaz's uncle lives directly next to Small.
I was there on Tuesday with my uncle having dinner. So, I just left that building, and then the next day you just see the cops, the crime scene.
The surveillance video tells a part of the story.
Coming in and coming out of the apartment with different articles of clothes, different wigs. So it's weird, so that's why I called.
In the images, Johnson is seen with a blue bin, cleaning supplies, and even wearing a blonde wig. Police say Johnson shot Small and then dismembered the body. Then a search of Johnson's Harlem apartment revealed the remainder of the body, the arms and the head inside of a freezer.
There's nothing to say, there's no words to describe that.
48-year-old Johnson is no stranger to the law. He was sentenced for attempted murder and robbery, spending over 20 years in prison. Since his release, he was working as a counselor to help at-risk youth at the Queens Public Defender's Office. Last month, he made an appearance on the Joe Rogan podcast.
And when I got out, I made a decision that I was going to walk away, and I didn't care about what the consequences was. And I said to myself, I've been doing bad for so long, I'm going to try to do something good. If all else fails, I could always go back to doing bad.
Johnson is back in jail, and he's facing charges of murder, manslaughter, and criminal possession of a weapon. Now, we called the Queens Defender's Office, and we haven't heard back. In the Bronx, Naveen Dhaliwal, CBS 2 News.
The final 24 hours of Collin Small's life are preserved not through statements, not through confessions, but through grainy surveillance footage and the terrified testimony of a neighbor who heard everything except the reason why. The footage shows Collin walking into his 6th floor apartment. Alive, calm, wearing an outfit investigators would later memorize frame by frame. Nothing about his demeanor hinted at danger. He was alone. He unlocked his door. And then, for the rest of the night, he disappeared into the privacy of his home, a space that should have protected him. Sometime shortly after midnight, the building's stillness shattered. A tenant on the floor heard what sounded unmistakably like gunfire, 2 sharp cracks echoing through the hallway walls. She froze. Gunshots in a building like theirs weren't unheard of, but what came next was a man's voice, panicked, begging, "Please don't. I have a family." There was a pause, a moment of silence so abnormal she described it as a dead, heavy stop. Then 2 more gunshots. Silence again. No screams. No footsteps. Just an awful stillness that told her something in apartment 6F had gone terribly wrong. That tenant's instinct told her this wasn't firecrackers. This wasn't noise. This was violence. She reached out to the superintendent to report what she heard. And that decision, simple, immediate, would later unravel everything. Concerned, the building superintendent didn't wait until morning. He accessed the surveillance cameras for the 6th floor. What he saw was shocking enough that he replayed the footage multiple times to make sure his eyes weren't deceiving him. A man moving in and out of Collin's apartment. Not once, not twice, but repeatedly over hours. And each time he stepped into the hallway, something was different. A new hat, a new shirt, a wig, a disguise. He wasn't just entering and leaving. He was transforming himself between visits, almost like he was trying to scramble the timeline, confuse anyone who might later question the footage, or give the illusion that multiple people had been coming and going. And then came the moment that froze the superintendent. The man on camera was now wearing the exact same outfit Collin had been wearing earlier that night. The same clothing seen on Collin when he walked into apartment 6F for the last time. Whoever was in the hallway wasn't Collin. The build was different, the walk was different, yet he was dressed in the victim's clothes. The super watched horrified as the disguised figure carried cleaning supplies, a mop, and finally a large blue plastic bin, entering and exiting the apartment with unnerving calmness. This wasn't panic. This wasn't grief. This was methodical. Unable to shake the suspicion, the superintendent finally called 911. He told operators a resident may have been harmed, that there were possible gunshots. that someone else had been entering and exiting the victim's unit since the early morning hours. Police said they would dispatch officers, but it would take 9 hours before they arrived. Time, the one thing that could have preserved more evidence, slipped away. While the clock ticked, the man in the footage kept moving between the hallway and the apartment, bringing items, removing items, changing clothes, working quietly behind a door that no one dared to open. And each minute that passed made one question louder. What was happening inside apartment 6F? When police finally knocked on the door, nothing about the man who opened it matched what they expected. When officers finally arrived at 8:25 p.m., nearly 9 hours after the superintendent's call, the hallway outside apartment 6F felt charged, tense, almost expectant. The tenant who reported the gunshots stayed in her home, listening. The superintendent hovered close enough to guide police, but far enough to show he wanted no part in what might be behind that door. The officers approached cautiously, knocked, announced themselves, and waited. The door opened, but wasn't Collin Small standing there. It was Sheldon Johnson, a man who had no legal reason to be in that apartment. A man whose public life was all about rehabilitation and second chances. A man who, at that moment, stood in the doorway of a crime scene he claimed to know nothing about. When police asked for Collin, Sheldon didn't hesitate. He didn't stumble. He didn't act confused. He simply said, Collin went upstate. Upstate. No bags packed. No signs of travel. No explanation for why Sheldon was standing in Collin's doorway instead of Collin himself. The officers stepped inside and immediately sensed something was wrong. The air was heavy, metallic. The apartment looked disturbed, yet selectively cleaned. Certain items were missing. Others seemed intentionally out of place. As they moved deeper into the apartment, something caught their attention. A large blue bin sitting on the floor. It was the same type of bin the superintendent had seen Sheldon carrying on footage hours earlier. And that's when the horror unfolded. Inside the bin were human remains, a headless torso, and 2 severed feet. Elsewhere in the apartment, detectives found additional body parts, including arms that appeared to match the torso. Paramedics confirmed the victim was deceased. The medical examiner later determined Collin had been killed by a single gunshot to the head, with bullet fragments still lodged in the skull, a detail that contradicted the multiple shots heard by the tenant, suggesting some shots may have missed or struck other surfaces. The apartment wasn't just a crime scene. It was a processing site, a place where someone had taken time and effort to hide what they had done. Sheldon Johnson was detained immediately. He continued to insist he was innocent. But detectives already knew something crucial. This apartment wasn't the end of the story. There were still missing body parts. And to find those, investigators had to follow Sheldon all the way to Harlem. After discovering the dismembered remains in the Bronx, investigators wasted no time securing a search warrant for Sheldon Johnson's residence, a Fifth Avenue apartment in Harlem. If Collin's Bronx apartment revealed violence, the Harlem apartment revealed intent. Inside a standard household freezer, the kind found in any home, detectives uncovered what they had been missing. Collin Small's head, his legs, and one arm. Neatly stored. Cold. Hidden, but not hidden well enough. The dismemberment wasn't chaotic or rushed. It showed shape, structure, and chilling calculation. Investigators also found concrete residue inside Sheldon's vehicle, bags of concrete mix, a full Tyvek protective suit, cleaning chemicals, tools consistent with dismemberment. Concrete suggested future plans, encasing remains, sinking them, burying them. It pointed to a level of planning that prosecutors would later describe as organized concealment. The Harlem apartment changed the investigation instantly. This wasn't a panic-driven crime. This was systematic, deliberate, prolonged. The timeline in the Bronx, the disguises, the clothing changes, the blue bin, the cleaning supplies, everything suddenly made sense. If police had arrived earlier, the remains might never have been transported. If the superintendent hadn't checked the cameras, the crime might have gone undetected until it was too late. If a neighbor hadn't been awake during those gunshots, Collin Small might have vanished without anyone realizing when or how he died.
Evil crime. 48-year-old Sheldon Johnson, accused of killing a man and dismembering his body. But Johnson says they have the wrong man.
I'm innocent.
But now the horror was undeniable, and the motive was still completely unknown. With the remains recovered, prosecutors moved fast, and the world turned on a man they once celebrated. With the evidence in hand, detectives and prosecutors moved quickly. They reconstructed the timeline using surveillance footage, the witness account of gunshots, the superintendent's report, Forensic analysis. The medical examiner's ruling. Items found in both apartments. The sequence of disguises worn by Sheldon. Piece by piece, they built a picture of what happened between midnight and the evening of March 5th. Sheldon Johnson was formally charged with second-degree murder, manslaughter, criminal possession of a weapon, concealment of a human corpse. In court, he continued to insist he was innocent. Cameras captured him telling reporters he was being framed, that he had nothing to do with the murder, that his past shouldn't define him. But the public and the media saw something else. A man who had built his life around redemption. A man who stood on stages preaching transformation. A man who appeared on podcasts as a mentor and role model. A man trusted by institutions, youth programs, even legal advocates. And now, that same man was accused of one of the most gruesome killings in recent New York memory. It wasn't just a crime. It was a collapse, the implosion of everything he claimed to be. But one question lingered in every headline, every broadcast, every conversation. Why? Why would Sheldon kill a man he had known for decades? Why would he dismember him? Why wear his clothes? Why the disguises? Why the concrete? Prosecutors had charges. Detectives had evidence. But motive? That remained a void, a silence as chilling as the crime itself. And that silence raises questions far bigger than this case, questions about communities, re-entry, and the thin line between redemption and relapse. The news of Collin Small's murder spread fast, but what stunned the city wasn't just the brutality, it was the identity of the accused. Within hours, reporters swarmed the courthouse steps, demanding answers about how a man held up as a beacon of reform could be connected to something so gruesome. Activists were stunned. Youth programs he worked with scrambled to distance themselves. Organizations that once celebrated him were left questioning whether they had mistaken charisma for transformation. Small's family, meanwhile, faced the unbearable weight of grief, not only mourning the loss of someone they loved, but watching his story drown under the shadow of Sheldon's public identity. They had to watch the world focus on the fallen advocate, while the victim, a man whose final words were a plea for his family, risked being reduced to a footnote. But the community around the Highbridge building felt something else entirely: fear. How long had the danger been so close? How had someone like Sheldon walked their halls unnoticed? And could this tragedy have been prevented? The truth is, behind cases like this are lessons every community needs to understand before another life is lost. Every homicide is unique, but Collin's case exposes gaps that can still be closed. First, when gunshots or pleas for help are heard, calling emergency services immediately matters. The tenant reported what she heard, but hours passed before police arrived, a delay that could have destroyed crucial evidence. In urban buildings where hundreds share walls and hallways, fast escalation can save lives or catch offenders before they erase their tracks. Second, surveillance awareness is a powerful tool. The superintendent's quick check of the cameras was the reason this crime unraveled. Noticing unusual patterns, repeated entries, disguises, large containers, gives law enforcement something concrete to act on. Third, communities must understand that redemption narratives are not guarantees. Rehabilitation is real and possible, but public praise can sometimes overshadow ongoing struggles, untreated trauma, or hidden instability. Support systems, accountability, and mental health resources matter just as much as second chances. These lessons aren't about blame, they are about awareness. But beyond the lessons lies a deeper theme, one that makes this case more than just a story of violence. Some crimes don't begin on the night they happen. They begin years earlier, in unresolved trauma, old loyalties, and the weight of a past that never truly lets go. Collin Small and Sheldon Johnson were two men shaped by the same system, the same neighborhoods, the same early violence. Their lives ran parallel, twisted, and eventually collided in the most tragic way possible. One man tried to rebuild quietly. The other rebuilt loudly. But both carried shadows the world never fully understood. Collin's last words remind us that behind every headline is someone who loved and was loved, someone whose story deserved more than the way it ended. And Sheldon's downfall forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Redemption is powerful, but it cannot stand alone on charisma. Real change requires stability, support, and accountability that cannot be faked. And it's that human truth that brings us to one final question, one I leave with you. Now that you've heard this story, the violence, the betrayal, the unanswered mystery, I want to hear from you. Will you believe led to this tragic crossroads? A buried grudge? A moment of rage? A fracture in a man the world thought was rehabilitated? Or something far more complex? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your perspective helps keep Collin's story alive and reminds us that behind every case, there's a human truth waiting to be understood.